In this section, we're going to start to really get a better idea of what was really occurring on our terminal when we executed that docker build command. We're going to walk through each of these steps and not really analyze the structure of each of them, but really analyze the effect that they had on the image that we were building. So to get started, I first want to talk a little bit about the output that we saw in our terminal when we executed the docker build command. So first things first, why do we use docker build? Well, this is a new command that we have not used before tied to the Docker CLI. Remember what we said a little bit ago, when we create our Docker file, we then feed it into the Docker client, which turns around and gives your file off to the Docker server. And that's what builds your usable image. So when we ran docker build dot, that was us giving our Docker file off to the Docker CLI. The build command is what we use to take a Docker file and generate an image out of it. The dot right here is specifying what is called the build context. The build context is essentially the set of files and folders that belong to our project. It's a set of files and folders that we want to kind of encapsulate or wrap in this container. And we'll see some better examples of exactly what the build context is used for later on throughout the course, as our Docker builds start to get a little bit more complex. After running that command, we then very quickly saw a whole bunch of outputs start to scroll on by. The first thing I want you to notice here is that for every line of configuration that we put into our Docker file, we got an additional step added to this flow. So I see step 1 of 3 corresponds to the first line of our Docker file. I see step 2 of 3 corresponding to the second line, and I bet you can guess the third one down here, step 3 of 3 corresponded to the third line of the Docker file. Now with the very first step where we said from Alpine, the first thing that occurred was the Docker server looked at our local build cache and it checked to see if it has ever downloaded an image called Alpine before. In our case, it probably hasn't, so the first thing that occurred was the Docker server reached out to the Docker Hub, which you'll recall is a repository of existing Docker images that are free for public use, and it downloaded that image, the image called Alpine. So pull complete means, yep, it was successfully downloaded, and well, it really tells you that very clearly right here. Downloaded newer image for Alpine latest. So that first step right there, kind of boring. We basically just downloaded an initial starting image to use as a base. Things started to get a little bit more interesting on step number 2 right here. So there's a couple of lines of code or output right here that I want you to really take a very good look at. You'll notice the first line right here says running in and then an ID. So that's very key right there. I want you to remember that for just a second. And then a little bit lower, you'll notice that it says removing intermediate container. And it printed out the exact same ID that we saw back up there. So it looks like this ID right here is the ID of a container. But what container? We'll dive into that in just a second when we look at a diagram that's going to kind of explain this flow. You'll notice that we also saw some very similar output down here for step 3 as well, where it said running in blah, blah, blah. And then very shortly after that, removing intermediate container. One last thing I want to point out here is that for step number 1 up here, you'll notice that there is no kind of like intermediate container printout. So it appears that for every instruction that we added to the Docker file, besides the first one, it appears that some like container of sorts was created. So, with that in mind, let's flip over to a diagram and really walk through what just occurred. All right. Now, I know we're going through this stuff like really intense and in-depth, but honestly, getting a very fundamental or solid understanding of this Docker build process is really going to help you understand Docker in general. That's why we're going through so much detail. Okay, so in this diagram, we've got a container on the right-hand side, we've got the Alpine image on the bottom left, and then our series of 3 commands over here. So the first thing we did was specify from Alpine. And as we saw, that basically went out and downloaded the Alpine image off of Docker Hub. Remember that an image has a file system snapshot and some startup command. And at this point, we don't really know what the startup command for Alpine is, but we don't really care that much. The next line was the run apk add update Redis. So here's exactly what happened behind the scenes. When Docker server saw this line of configuration right here, it looked back at the last step that just occurred. So it looked back at this step, the from Alpine step. It looked at the image that came out of that previous step. The image that came out of the previous step was the Alpine image. Then on the run line right here, it took that image and created a new container out of it. So in memory, we very temporarily got a brand new container created at the very start of step number 2. And that's what this running in blah, blah, blah right here means. It means that it created a temporary container out of the image that was sourced during the previous step. So we can kind of imagine that we took the entire file system snapshot from the Alpine image and we stuffed it into this very temporary container that was created just for the second step right here, or the second instruction. After creating this temporary container, this command right here, the command that we just added on, was executed inside that container as its primary running process. So we took that run command, we took that line or that full command right there, and we executed it as a process inside of the container. So this is this container's primary running process. As we said in the last video, APK is a package manager that is built into the Alpine image. So this command executed inside the container, and while it executed, it went through the process of downloading Redis. That's what happened right here. It downloaded and installed Redis and a couple of dependencies for Redis. So we can imagine that during that installation process, we maybe got some like new folder on this container's hard drive right there. Maybe it was something called like simply Redis. Now, I want this to represent the Redis program. It didn't install it in the root directory or anything like that, but let's just imagine that APK add downloaded and installed Redis onto this container's little hard drive right here. So we now have a container that has a file system snapshot that contains the newly installed copy of Redis. Now look at what happened immediately after that. After that container, or excuse me, after that package was installed, we then stopped that container. We took a file system snapshot of that container, and then we stopped it entirely. So we're saying right here, that temporary container that was just created, we stop it, and we then take its current file system snapshot, and we save it as a temporary image with this ID right here. So the output of everything inside of step number 2 is a new image that contains just the changes that we made during this step. So we can now kind of imagine that this ID right here, this is the ID to a very temporary image. So I'm now going to update the image down here on the top left-hand side. And I'm going to say that is the 3.8 EC image. And inside that image, it now has a installed copy of Redis. And we also threw away that intermediate container. So that is the end result of step number 2. In total, we created a temporary container out of the Alpine image. We executed this command inside that container, and then we took that container's file system and saved it as a temporary image. So we now have this very temporary file system snapshot right here that has Redis included. Then we move on to step number 3, where we execute CMD right here. So I bet you can imagine what happens here. With CMD, we're going to look at the image that was generated during the previous step. So in this case, the image that was taken from the previous step is this 3.8 EC image. We create a new, very temporary container out of it. And when we make that container, we take the image's file system snapshot and stuff it into this container. And then with the CMD, this is setting the primary command or the primary process of the container. So the container does not actually execute Redis server. It doesn't execute this command. It just tells the container, hey, like, just so you know, if you were to ever run for real, you should be running Redis server as your primary command. So the container is told this is supposed to be your intermediate, or something, this is supposed to be your primary command, and then it shuts down that container and takes a snapshot of its file system and its primary command. So the end result is successfully built this ID right here. This is the final image that was created out of this entire series of steps. So in step number 3, at the very end, we remove the intermediate container. We take a snapshot of its file system and its primary command, and then we save it as an output, as an image with an ID of FC60. So here's the container, the very temporary one. We take a snapshot of its file system. So I'm going to put it over here. And we also take a snapshot of its running primary command, or excuse me, not running primary command, but primary command that should be executed when the container starts up in the future. And so we specify the startup command as Redis server, and then we save that entire thing as an image with the ID of FC60. And so the end result is this right here. The end result is our image with that ID that has our full file system snapshot with Redis installed and a startup command that has been specified. All right, so at long last, that is the full story. That is what happened with the Docker file. Now, the real takeaway that I want you to understand here is that basically along every step along the way, not basically every step, but really every step along the way, with every additional instruction, we essentially take the image that was generated during the previous step, we create a new container out of it, we execute a command in the container, or make a change to its file system. We then look at that container, we take a snapshot of its file system and save it as an output for the next instruction along the chain. And then when there is no more instructions to execute, the image that was generated during that last step is output from the entire process as the final image that we really care about. Whew. So that's a lot of information. So let's take a quick pause right here and we'll continue in the next section.